All right. Well, everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, as I mentioned, it's a gorgeous sunny day outside, and I'm certainly very grateful that everybody has spent their time or is going to spend their time listening to us. So we've got a really interesting conversation. It's really timely. But first, I do want to acknowledge our sponsor with this webinar, which is the Masters of Supply Chain Management, Global Supply Chain Management Program that we are launching at RIT this fall. It's very exciting. I teach in it. Some other people on the call, I believe Professor Tong is somewhere on here. There's a bunch of people, so I can't quite see it. I assume he's here. And he also teaches in the program, as well as Professor Kazanchi. And it's an amazing program that provides well-rounded analytical as well as leadership skills, negotiations. It's an exceptional program, and I believe we're going to chat a little bit more about that towards the end, but do want to acknowledge that program's support in getting everything going. So I think normally I would have to start one of these discussions and saying, can anybody ever think about a supply chain disruption, or can anybody ever think about what type of risks supply chains might face? But given that COVID-19 has nearly entirely upended supply chains from raw materials all the way until final distribution, I don't need to drum up any anecdotal evidence to talk about that. And so what we're going to focus on today is less about the national conversation associated with COVID-19 and the impact it's having on supply chains, but we're going to bring it back to our area. And so what we're going to do is we have two experts, and I'm going to stop talking in a moment. We've got Brad Weber from Wegmans, and we've got Scott Clements from ArcBest Freight. They're going to kind of key in through a guided discussion that I'm just going to ask questions and really let them take over. They're going to guide us through their perspective on what's going on in the local market as it relates to the supply chain disruption as a result of COVID. So without further ado, very briefly, I'll introduce myself. I'm Professor Steven Carnovale. I teach in the supply chain management undergraduate as well as graduate program here at RIT. I study supply chain risk and disruption as an academic pursuit. So this is particularly fascinating for me to have a conversation about. I'm going to pass it over to Brad and let Brad introduce himself, and then Scott after that, and then I'll take it over and start asking some questions.
Hi, everybody. My name's Brad Weber. Steven mentioned I'm a logistics coordinator at Wegmans currently. I've worked at Wegmans for about 13 years in a variety of positions throughout the supply chain, everything from operations in our warehouses and trucking to more planning roles, which I'm in right now. So as a logistics coordinator, basically what I'm doing is arranging freight and inbound deliveries from across the country, mainly in produce and grocery, to deliver to our facilities both here in Rochester and another one of our facilities in Pennsylvania. My RIT connection, I actually just finished my MBA this past December in Saunders. Luckily, I'm fortunate I got out of there before this all happened, so I finished up in December and technically just graduated last month. Would have taken part in that. So that's me, and I'll pass it over to Scott.
Great accomplishment, Brad. Great school. So my name is Scott Clements. I have lived in Rochester my whole life. I've been with my wife, who is a proud RIT employee. She works at the Ritter Arena doing this Learn Skate program, and I have a daughter in the junior graphic design daughter. I've been with ArcBest starting my 23rd year. My area of responsibility runs from Windsor, Ontario to Albany. I have 11 different service centers, 16 different account managers. I've been in supply chain for 26 years with two different organizations, 23 with this company and in a small regional LTL carrier named Preston Trucking that's no longer in existence. I have mainly focused on the people on my team. I do a lot of customer facing discussions at high levels in the Rochester area, in Toronto, in Buffalo, are the main hubs where we're having these discussions that are relevant to the conversation today.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Scott. So with all that said, let's dive right in. Time waits for no one. So the biggest thing that people talk about as it relates to really any disruption, I mean, you can go back to 2008 or the recession prior to that, bubble bursting and so on. And they talk about these things like it's a black swan, right? Because it doesn't exist until it exists. And when it does, it blows your mind. So bringing it back to our area, what lessons have you guys learned and what are you seeing as it relates to dealing with, preparing for, forecasting, etc., a COVID-19 related or something very similar, pandemic related disruption? What have you guys learned? What could you distill for us about that? Either Scott or Brad, whoever would like to go first.
I'll jump in first. So I think the biggest thing we learned from this one in particular is just how to understand change over time. Because if I think back to when COVID really started in February, we almost started treating it initially like it was going to be a big snowstorm. We think about when everyone kind of went into panic buying mode and stuff was flying off the shelves. You know, we kind of were in the idea that that would only last for a week or two and this would all blow over and go back to normal. Obviously, that's not the case. And we're now seeing that this is probably never going to blow over. There's going to be changes in consumer behavior forever coming out of this, and kind of understanding that some of those changes that we made initially to react to it, how are we going to make those sustainable? So it's, you know, it's pretty easy to do it once for a month or so. It's a lot different if you want to start building that into your overall business plan for years to come. So the longevity of this, I think that's still what everyone's kind of digesting. From our aspect in logistics, it's a matter of, you know, we're always looking for different ways to improve service and efficiency to get the product to our facilities. And now we just got to take a lot of things into account that were different only a few months ago and make sure that we're going to be able to keep those going for the next, you know, foreseeable future.
I guess what I would say is I'm a little bit older. I'm losing my hair and getting a little bit gray. I think COVID is another example of how something that is unforeseen changes consumers' behavior, changes all of our behavior. And I kind of just look at it from the perspective of in my own house and how it's affected my relationships with my family, my immediate family, and then with my work family, and how we're communicating differently, the different technologies that we've adapted to. And, you know, with every one of these disruptions, I think one of the things that I love about Wegmans in terms of their values and in terms of how they approach their people in the market is they do a better job of listening to their customers than anyone. They listen to their people and they listen to their customers. And there's going to be another form of COVID. There's going to be another trade war. There's going to be a recession. There's going to be labor disputes. I mean, if you think about it, if UPS didn't go on strike when they did a number of years ago, we wouldn't have FedEx or that famous Tom Hanks movie. So I think that the key to all of this is there's going to be something after COVID that's going to disrupt supply chains. And it's really, I think that the key thing to all of this is really being on top of technology, being digitally connected to your consumers, to your customers, to your supply chain. I think to really thrive in this day and age, I think you got to be a front runner in technology. I think we need to listen to our consumers or our customers, our suppliers better than ever. And then I think the third thing of that is the ability of your company to change, or your organization to change, or your family to change. In the companies that are thriving year after year are the companies that are taking a look at those three foundations of technology, of listening to their customers, and then changing faster than the competition. I think that's the key to the three different types of companies in this current supply chain disruption. There's three companies in the way that we're looking at it, is companies that are thriving, that because of this situation and where they're positioned and how their supply chain works, they're taking full advantage of it. there's companies that are adapting and making the most of it. Repurposing Black Button Distillery, making hand sanitizer. I mean, they've gotten a lot of very good publicity for doing that. So I think those are the key three things. The key four things are: one, there's going to be another COVID type disruption, and then technology, listening to consumers, our customers, organizations, and then changing faster than competition are the things. That's just how we're looking at it.
No, it's an interesting perspective too. And actually, you brought up something that I was gonna, in my characteristic way, throw a curveball into the whole mix. So prior to this happening, this being COVID-19, prior to that happening, there had been trade tensions going on between the U.S. and many parts of the world. One in particular, what some people call the world's factory, China. And so we had tariffs going up and tensions rising between our two nations as it related to trade policy. Brad, in particular, did you guys see, or do you think that had a kind of negative carryover effect to the impact that COVID had? So basically, what impact did you see from the trade war, if any? And then if you did that carry over to how Wegmans is operating on a daily basis as far as fulfillment?
So as far as China for our being a supplier for us, it's mainly, if anything, in kind of the general merchandising and things like that. So if you think about, you see those Adirondack plastic chairs outside the store, those are things that come from China. So a lot of lead time on those. Most of the time we're ordering that stuff almost a year in advance. So ordering stuff this summer for next summer. So I think there's probably still some lag to come from that between the trade war and COVID that we'll see some impact on the product side. But really the immediate impact we saw from the trade war was in trucking capacity on the West Coast. So a lot of our produce comes out of the West Coast, and not saying it comes from China, but with those trucks on the West Coast, every truck has a decision. Do they want to pick up produce to take to Wegmans, or they want to pick up something from the port to take to someone else? So it's competition for that trucking capacity. So if we saw any impact, it would be that, where maybe prices were a little higher because, or lower depending on where the trade war was, if there was more or less demand coming into the West Coast as far as imports. Again, we weren't necessarily getting the imports, but we were competing for the trucks that were going to move our product versus that product.
And that's the really interesting part. And then I'm going to pivot over to you, Scott. But that's the really interesting part about this COVID. So any type of supply chain disruption, when we define it, it's just anything that interrupts the normal operating state of a supply chain. We think about a supply chain from end to end, raw materials all the way until we receive the products that we're talking about. But the thing with COVID is that the interruptions, not only are they happening not just one level back or two levels back, they're happening simultaneously one level back, but it's also going one level forward from raw materials up because of what you're saying with trucking capacity, Brad. And it's also happening, there's a compounding effect that people aren't foreseeing yet, and I think and I agree with you before, Scott, where you said there's going to be another COVID-esque, disruption. 100% agree with you. The interesting thing about this one, why it would probably be considered a black swan, is that there were mandated closures where previously it was the best practice to do so. And so I'm going to transition over to you with the next question. What changes have you guys seen or done or heard about or are thinking about as it relates to your supply chain processes, given COVID and preparing for the next one?
Well, I mean, the processes for us, I mean, there hasn't been an account manager in our company that's been in a service center. So we're really minimizing the risk at a local level. In terms of, things that we're seeing, I mean, local manufacturers, you think about a $300 million or $795 million company trying to produce private label tomato products, trying to do that in a safe environment where you've got to have your employees 6 feet apart. That takes some planning. That really takes some adjustment. And, you know, on top of trying to figure out how you're going to actually be able to produce, then you got to try to figure out, okay, what's the demand going to look like? Not only today, but tomorrow and beyond. And then from there, then what's the cost structure going to look like?
Mm-hmm.
We're already to the point with that we're seeing is that we're to the cost structure to the point where the companies are the buyers of products that of tomatoes, for example. They're trying to understand what the cost structure is going to be so that they can then adjust their rates and stay in business. So anytime there's uncertainty and variability in a supply chain, it becomes more expensive just because of the nature of not understanding fully. So a lot of times inventories tend to creep up. What's interesting in the combination of these two events with the trade war, everyone was depleting their inventories to try to minimize their exposure to the tariffs. And now having done that, now you add in COVID, that adds a lot more complexity to what's going on. And I think that's another reason why people need to be looking at, you know, digitalizing their supply chain networks.
Yeah, that's the relationship between chaos and inventory is a fascinating one, because to your point, you know, on the one side of the coin, inventory is a strategic weapon to buffer against uncertainties. We have it so that if Wegmans runs out, we have it, or you know, you could take any example out there. That's why you keep inventory. But we've been monitoring this kind of stuff, and what we found with our last round of study on our logistics managers index, we found that growth was increasing at an increasing rate. So meaning it was growing in very rapidly for inventory levels, for warehousing utilization, and for transportation capacity. Now, it could have been that that's been in response to the shock that Brad and you both saw in March and April. But given that we're seeing this increase back to using inventory as a strategic tool, beefing up warehousing capacity and things like that, how do you see the landscape, just at a very general level, changing in the future? So as a concrete example, Brad, you mentioned that right now, the only things that you really source from China, or really outside the US perhaps, and you can clarify, is the general merchandise and things like that. Do you see the global nature of supply chains with your suppliers, let's say, or if you go even one tier back with their suppliers, do you see that changing in the future?
So I think one of the things, kind of touching on a few of those points, is definitely going before this and then the last few years prior, the focus has definitely been on driving down inventory and making the supply chain a lot more lean. So obviously you have less investment in inventory sitting in warehouses, and you use that money to build new stores. With this, you know, it goes completely against that concept, because that depends, having low inventory depends on continuous and smooth demand, which in a grocery chain, usually you see that throughout the year. If you put the demand charts for our stores on top of each other each year, you know, you can tell which weeks the holidays were in and which weeks they weren't. What COVID did was it threw a completely unexpected, you know, Christmas in the beginning of the year. So when it really hit, you know, we were seeing volumes at the store that were similar to Christmas that had never happened during that time of the year before.
Wow.
So, you know, in our grocery chain was not the only one. I'm sure they all were across the country, and different businesses that were still open. So to try and plan for that's obviously impossible, and you don't want to hope that doesn't happen again next year. So it's difficult to forecast against it. But really, how do you work with your suppliers going backwards? I think it's kind of, you know, integrating your businesses together to make sure that they're both have the same priorities. I think about in produce specifically, you know, a lot of our produce comes from the West Coast, and you know, gets trucked across 5 days to get here, and that's the best practice right now, because that's the only place that produce is grown in the country. But one thing Wegmans does a great job of is working with vendors along the East Coast, and even, you know, there's an organic farm. Wegmans has its own farm down on Canandaigua Lake that they use for some research and development, and trying to spread, you know, work with our vendors to make sure that they're making the products that we're going to want at the right time, so that if there is a disruption someplace on the West Coast and we can't get product from there, we'll have a backup source someplace potentially even closer. And then the long term, hopefully trying to move some of that business closer to us so we have less expenses in some of those transportation and warehousing expenses. So really, it's, if you think about your relationship with the suppliers, it's got to be good for both, so that when something like this happens, you're in it together with them and you're able to help both ways.
So Scott, I'm going to point that one right to you. So because it's fascinating, the complementary nature of you and Brad, you being in the freight side, Brad being in the consumer side. How do you think you guys are going to change, if at all, based on what happened here, as far as maybe pricing or capacity or anything?
Well, for us, we're like any company where, you know, there's actually, we're an asset-based third-party logistics company. So we're scaling based on the work that we have, and that's a daily decision we're making. So that when a company is shrinking, it's the hardest to control costs. It's very hard because you have all those overhead fixed costs of running a facility to turn the lights on. So really managing that part of the business is really the hardest part right now, because you're also talking about people's lives, and people that we care about know that you may have to make that decision that they can't come to work. And that's a responsibility we sign up for, but that's not fun. There's definitely a people impact to this. So from a very granular level, those are great conversations to have with your people. Very much like Wegmans, you look at their 5 values, every one of them is tied to their people. It's pretty impressive. And I think our company is similar in that way. So I think that the first part of it is really understanding what's going on and trying to be as efficient as possible. And I think that's what's happening internally within our company. On the truckload brokerage side, exactly what Brad described in terms of capacity in specific lanes. I mean, everyone's looking at load boards and understands very easily and quickly what's going on with capacity based on seasons. You know, we were chartering planes for hand sanitizer. We've done a lot of things that, I mean, I was at Wegmans last night picking up a prescription, and I saw 2 bins of hand sanitizer for, I think one was $4.49 and one was like $8. And, you know, you start thinking about flying a plane of hand sanitizer, and you know that the cost is through the roof. It was mainly hand sanitizer and PPE for the largest telecommunications company in Canada, so that they could get their company compliant and safe as they reopen. So I guess what I would say is, as soon as you can start finding certainty and start building from there, and then start creating the efficiencies, and really internally telling everyone the why within your company or your organization, and having the why with your supplier or your customer, you know, that communication's key, and really constant flow of creating win-win situations.
So, okay, now I want to, we've got 2 sections of this left. The first is, we've got one question that I want to chat with you about in terms of looking at hiring people. What are you looking for? That's going to be the second. The first is, Brad brought something interesting up that I'd like to ask both of you. So lean. People have been talking about lean since Toyota, 80s. Minimize inventories. I've always kind of argued that lean is really pushing inventory on your suppliers, right? So with everything being said, thinning out the on-the-books inventory, and it doesn't have to necessarily be the focal company. I mean, it doesn't have to be the Wegmans. It could be the 1 tier back, the 2 tier back, whatever. What do you guys see happening with lean? Either as it relates to capacity, Scott, for freight, or products, Brad. I mean, I know you guys are trying to thin out inventory, as you mentioned, but is lean still a viable strategy with COVID related pandemics on the horizon?
I think in certain product classes, you're going to see people becoming a little more gun shy about being lean. For our company specifically, some of our leanest items were paper and water. And going into this, we all kind of saw, that's a strategic decision for years that has been going on to, minimize inventory in those because they take up a lot of space. They have a lot of constant demand. So it just makes sense that if the demand's constant and it takes up a lot of space, it's easier to keep less inventory and, shuttle it through. But in that whole space, I mean, we're not the only ones with that idea. And if you go back a few tiers to who's even producing the toilet paper and water, they're doing the same thing. They're keeping their production lean. So if you think about those two in particular, when this COVID hit and panic buying or necessary buying, whatever you want to consider it, happened between toilet paper and water, and those were out of stock for weeks on end. From a company perspective, Wegmans, that's not something we want to have on our name. We want people going to the store and be able to get what they want. But it's also not just ourselves, it's the producers, because it wasn't the fact that we couldn't get product to the stores, it was the fact that that product didn't exist. It wasn't produced yet. So if everyone's going after the same few loads of water, few loads of paper, you kind of talked about Scott there saying about flying the hand sanitizer, there's some loads of paper that we paid a lot more money for during COVID than we've ever paid for in probably history. So I think lean is great for certain items and certain things, but you can't just treat it as the best situation for everything. So yeah, it's definitely strategic for certain things, but you should never just decide that you want your entire supply chain to be lean, because as soon as you do that, you're kind of removing the uniqueness out of supply chain and just treating everything as widgets, which that's not necessarily how it works in the real world. So again, yeah, it is good for some things. I think as we go forward, identifying those things is going to be a little tricky because folks will be a little nervous, but definitely it'll get back to that will exist, but in the right situations.
Right, and COVID and other related pandemics aren't going to force Wegmans to stock up on perishables just to have them in case it might happen, because by definition they perish. That's a great point. Scott, what about you? What are you guys doing as it relates to capacity and demand planning on freight?
Really what we're doing is really partnering with our customers to understand their entire supply chain and really get as much data and information as we can to understand what they're doing now and what they're trying to accomplish. And just taking all that data and just crunching it down to see what makes sense. So where are you sourcing from? Are you going to continue to source from there? Does it make sense to source from there? There's a lot of local companies that I think of Allison Athletic. They used to run cloth from the mills in Glens Falls, New York, and the Carolinas to Mexico, manufacture finished goods, bring them back up to Rochester, and they'd label them. They'd sew some labeling on them, NBA jerseys, and that's kind of the high profile stuff. And it went from that to now they're doing everything from China. They were doing everything from China before they closed, and bringing it in that way as a finished good, and then shipping baseball uniforms to California. It would be interesting to see if they were still here in Rochester, how they would be handling this. But I think what's happening is really people are evaluating their supply chains in a much more sophisticated way, because they have to look at their ways to create efficiencies and have their supply chain become a competitive advantage against their competition, and to be able to satisfy their customer needs. So we're seeing a lot more analytics and data being driven to us, in which we can do a lot of different studies in terms of where they're positioned in terms of warehousing to supply themselves, in terms of how many facilities they may need. We're looking at complete supply chain optimization, taking down the silos and looking at everything and how people are doing it and why they're doing it that way. From a company standpoint, from a customer standpoint, in terms of lean, there's a very famous local communications company that does a lot for the military and would like to do a lot more for municipalities, that they have a lot of land with the idea that they're going to bring their suppliers right on site. And that is somewhat of an old concept at this point. And for them, that's something that they're still trying to accomplish. So in terms of lean, I think a lot of customers are really trying to put that risk on the suppliers.
Yeah.
I see that's a continuation. That's not anything necessarily new.
Yeah, it's if it ain't broke, don't fix it. No, good point. Good point. So one thing you brought up is analytics, and I think just for anybody listening, that's probably the one thing that our master's program in supply chain drills home. It's analytical decision making for business and practical applications, and that's really, and we're going to get to that in a second. So I foresee analytics being the dominant skill of any career, supply chain, whatever. But I'm going to ask, kind of like rapid fire, so to speak, top 3 skill sets, Brad and Scott, in whichever order you prefer. Top 3 skill sets you'd like to see for the next candidate that you hire, so that when she comes in the door, she has these 3 skills. What would they be?
I'm not going to say, I'm going to give you I'm going to kind of change the question. I'm sorry, because it's not all a skill set. Analytical would be a trait that definitely be a trait that I would be looking for. I would say a hard worker. I'm always looking for somebody that has had to, Brad, you're working full time right now?
Yep.
I would be someone that's working full time, getting their master's degree, would be an example of somebody that I would be looking to hire.
Brad's been at Wegmans for like 15 years, so I don't think he's moving, Scott.
Oh, that's okay. But someone that has a proven track record of working hard, whether academically, in sports. And I think the third thing would be someone that's a team player, someone that is willing to come into an organization and with all the gifts and knowledge that they have, coming into a new organization with the understanding that we're going to be teaching them a lot, and we will be teaching them from the time they walk in the door until they leave. I've been there 23 years, and I'm learning something new every day because I'm hiring people that are teaching me and making me smarter. And so I want someone that is, I would say, a good teammate, and that they could coach me and I could coach them. And it's a two-way street. And, when we put 2 or 3 heads together, we're always coming up with the best strategy, the best decisions, and the best learning.
So equally important to you would be obviously the analytical mindset, but that the soft skills as well, being able to work well with other people and things like that, right?
Correct.
Okay, great. Brad.
Yeah, I think it almost sounds like we're on the same 3. So in one of my previous roles, I was a team leader for some of our entry-level supply chain coordinators at Wegmans. And the biggest 3 things we looked for when we were interviewing folks were, first, that they had people skills. I think Scott's done a great job of hyping up the Wegmans values, and that's one of the biggest things we have. But thinking about it in a supply chain perspective, the 2 first things would be people skills and technology skills. So in all of our roles in Wegmans supply chain, and really throughout supply chain, there's a lot of computer systems that help you do your job, but you also have to be able to pick up the phone and call someone and be able to interact with them and get the best solution when there's a problem that arises. So we have a lot of folks that, they might be better at one than the other. They might not be the best technical person, but they can certainly talk to people, or vice versa. But they really have to have both those skills. If we were looking at a candidate and we didn't feel confident that they had either, that was definitely some red flags. But as long as you can do both, you can balance the technology world with the people world, it's a good start. And then kind of adding in the COVID piece, the third part was always that adaptability and really the willingness to change. So we've always, probably in any job, we have folks that kind of get stuck in, in a rut, and it's, this is the way we've always done it. But we really want people who are able to change day by day. And whenever something comes up, whether it's something as big as COVID, or it's something as small as, a truck broke down or a store lost power, we need to have confidence that if it's someone working any time of the day or night, they're going to be able to work through that kind of ambiguity situation by themselves, and get the best solution, not just for Wegmans, but for everyone involved.
Awesome. So We're now at the portion of the discussion where you in the audience, if you have questions, please do submit them. So a couple came through to me privately, which I'll start with, but feel free to post questions as you have them to the main discussion board so that everybody can see them. You should be able to do that. If anybody can't raise their hand or indicate to me via a private message, and I'll look into it, but I assume everybody should be able to post a question to the chat board. If you go on the bottom of your screen and you see the little chat box, that is where you'll enter it. Okay, so the first question is going to be for Scott. Do you have a feel for inbound volume spent versus outbound volume spent? Is one higher than the other? Are they trending equally?
In the Rochester, is this question in the Rochester market or
Yeah,
in the?
let's start with Rochester and then whatever other observation you might have.
I think in the Rochester area, I think there's a lot more inbound traffic than outbound traffic.
Interesting. Okay. Is that a result of increased demand, or how do you see that?
I think Rochester community is mainly a service. Unfortunately, we're not really it's not necessarily our biggest employers aren't manufacturers. They're more service.
And now, do you see a difference in general between our area or the U.S. overall and Canada? Are you seeing differences in response and changes and so on?
Canada is very interesting. And I think probably the rest of the country doesn't really think about Canada, but because we're so close, Canada's really been, Canada probably knows the politics in our country better than our own citizens. I hate to say that, but they watch it very close because the trade war and the tariffs have had probably a bigger impact on them than us. And that combined with because they're so dependent on the oils in the West and the gas of the price of gas, that's why the disparity in the Canadian dollar. I can remember when I first started in this position 8.5 years ago, the Canadian dollar was worth $1.05. So I think that there's in Canada, I think there's as much in as out. I think that in the U.S., I think that there's just there's much more coming in.
Interesting. Okay, we've got some questions coming in. I'm going to kick this one over to Brad. Can you talk a little bit about the meat food supply chain? Do you see a continued interruption for the short term? Also, has Wegmans responded / pivoted in response to COVID as it relates to the meat supply chain?
So meat supply chain, there's obviously a lot of publicity around plants closing down around the country. I think one thing that I've just seen in the news is it seems like, that's a short-term disruption. It seems like those plants will be closed for maybe a couple weeks, if not months and months on end, with some of the government actions and changes there. So those should recover well, in my opinion, from a Wegmans perspective. Again, if you think about that competition, there's obviously only a certain amount of meat being produced, and when that goes down, when the supply goes down, the demand from everyone's going to go up. So from consumers, it seems like right now we're seeing exactly what we saw with the water and paper. A lot of kind of hoarding or panic buying, but that should balance out over time. But really, it's same things we've talked about. It's tough to tell right now until we start seeing some consistency and seeing the news go back to plants opening rather than plants closing. There's still going to be that mindset that there's a shortage, whether there is or isn't. So really, a lot of it's driven by the overall feel. But as far as Wegmans, there's not much change on that front. We're still using all the same vendors. Probably expanded some vendors to some ones that we've used in the past and maybe have gone away from. But there's certainly a lot of folks working on merchandising that meat as quickly as possible.
So this can go to either one or both. I might even chime in. Professors, if you give them a venue, they like to talk. So, but not me. Okay, so as it relates to the what the recovery will look like. There are a lot of shapes have been thrown about. Some people say it's going to be a U, some people say it's going to be a V, some people say it's going to be an L. Hard to say. What do you guys think the recovery is going to be? I mean, do you see just the slow interruption, then a rapid uptick? Do you see a gradual rise? And depending on your answer, what do we have to do with the local supply chain in order to cope with that? Scott, you want to kick it off?
Sure. I think it's the letter I'm going to use is a W. I think that it's going to ramp up. I think that there's going to be some cases that we're going to reevaluate, and then we're going to ramp up again. So I think it's going to be kind of an up, down, based on, more people being in circulation. There's going to be more cases that pop up again. And, I think people are going to pause and say, okay, is this a good idea? Or, evaluate. And then I think then we'll see a full recovery. That's kind of how I think it will go.
Brad, what about you? What do you foresee?
No, I agree that kind of cyclical concept there. One of the biggest things I've thought about is, when we look at our stores and just kind of seeing how the traffic patterns have changed over time. Again, previously it was very consistent. Now there's a lot more folks shopping on different days of the week. I know I was there a couple weekends ago and it was still very packed. So when we get into summer here, it'll be interesting to see how people adapt to the changes at the store level. I think when, a lot of the changes went in place and, there's, shields at the registers and not as many people in the store, people probably got caught off guard by that. And I think everyone's kind of adapting to it. And I feel like people are less intimidated to go to the stores. So I would expect store traffic's going to increase. Depending on what happens in the fall and winter, if there's more issues as far as spike ups in cases, we'll see if there's any additional changes. But I would imagine from a traffic perspective, it's going to be a slow return to normal traffic over time.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I hadn't thought about the W, one of the 26 letters that had not crossed my mind, but it does make a ton of sense, particularly if there's a second wave and we have to, adjust as a result. Okay. Can you guys comment on whether or not there are any positives as it relates to supply chain change, dynamics, et cetera, that have come as a result of COVID? Have you seen anecdotally, or perhaps even at your companies, any instances where supply chains have been improved for the better as a result of COVID? Any silver linings?
I'm seeing a lot of them. I think what we're seeing is a lot more companies analyzing the holistic supply chain, not just a piece here or a piece there. I think we're seeing a lot of companies really just breaking down the silos and looking at everything and trying to figure out best practices, and really a lot more partnership with companies like ours, where we can create efficiencies, we can create sometimes more lead time, sometimes, a lot of things we're doing with local companies. We got the company that private labels spaghetti sauce. We're bringing in many truckloads a week, and all of a sudden we've got another beverage producer that's 8 miles away, and, working with them to help them understand, hey, listen, I got to go to Oklahoma. I got to go to Owens in Oklahoma. You got anything going out west that way? So there's a lot more detailed conversations on the entire supply chain. And we're seeing that there's a lot of efficiencies that can be created when you look at the whole picture. And just just a simple Centroid study, if you got 5 warehouses, could you get away with 4? Could you get away with 2? I mean, that there's a lot of that type of analysis going on to really understand what would work for their customers, and what would be the best value and what would give them a competitive advantage in a lot of ways.
Brad, anything?
Yeah, I think from 2 points, looking at the store level, COVID definitely reassured everyone on the investment in like Instacart and digital. That was something that started up really a couple of years ago. And I think when it started, everyone was kind of unsure if it was really going to take off. Over the last couple of years, it certainly has been growing. But when this happened, you know, it was, for some people, literally, it was a lifesaver. People not having to go to the store, having their groceries delivered to them in an efficient manner. If you think about a mini supply chain, that's not necessarily part of our Wegmans supply chain, but the Instacart supply chain and people's home supply chains, getting stuff to them in a safe manner was huge. So at the store level, that was it. And then at a supply chain level, from our network, just thinking of the way we use our space. So I kind of described earlier that this was almost a Christmas in March. And when we have a normal Christmas in December, we have an entire year to get ready for it. And we'll use outside storage and find different capacity. But when this happened, we had to basically prepare for it in less than a week. So we were able to stand up some support buildings, you know, in different areas of the country by our stores that really helped smooth out the disruption as much as it could. You know, it's something we couldn't handle with what we traditionally use as far as facilities, but with partners who were definitely shifting, you know, their businesses from supplying businesses that were now closed and had room to take us in and help us out. That was the biggest thing I saw.
Okay, so here's what we've got on the docket. One more question, and then I'm going to pass it over to, I feel like Bob Barker, a word from our sponsors. But one more question is from Brendan, excuse me. Oh, this is a doozy. Okay, so we've been talking for years about outsourcing being a challenge, going abroad being a challenge because it's risky yet it's inexpensive. And actually, we've touched on it during this conversation. But given the chaos and everything that has ensued from COVID, do you foresee any portion of, or perhaps all, manufacturing returning back to the U.S. or at least continentally, you know, North America, or is it still too cost prohibitive despite the savings of that opportunity cost of a disruption? What do you guys foresee as it relates to that?
I think it really depends on how fast automation takes off. I mean, at this point, yes, it's still definitely cheaper to do everything abroad. I'm just speaking from a business perspective, but you'd imagine over time, I think about trucks in particular with self-driving and automated trucking eventually. You know, the reason it is expensive is because there's a lot of human interaction in it. And if you were able to remove some of that cost, yes, it would be cheaper. But when you think about the service versus efficiency, it may be more efficient, but if you are going to still get the same service. So over time, whether it's manufacturing, my example there of trucking, you know, you can make things very efficient, but you got to make sure you're maintaining that service level.
Scott, you guys know a few things about service levels, right?
Couple. You know, I think that, you know, I think a lot of this will have to do with what happens in November. I think that's another aspect of the conversation that no one's really brought up. But I think that what happens in November could have a direct impact on what happens in terms of, you know, outsourcing or bringing more manufacturing back into the United States. You know, personally, I'm praying that we bring some stuff back here. You look at local companies, Carrier Corporation in Syracuse, Dakin in Auburn, Ortho Clinical that is out on in the Greece area or the Gates area right now. I mean, if you look at those three companies, that was around 4,000 employees, 4,000 citizens of Rochester and Syracuse that lost their jobs because those jobs went to Mexico. So I don't mean to be political, but I think it really depends. There is a dependency on, I think, the commodity. I think pharma, definitely, we got to get that back here. I mean, we can't have 90% of that outsourced. So I think there's a political aspect to it. There is a buy the commodity aspect to it. And there's going to be what the consumers are willing to pay aspect to it as well.
Yeah, no, those three things always intersect with the facility location decisions. Well, guys, thank you so much for participating in this. This was great. I'm sure I speak for everybody in saying it was really illuminating. And now, as I mentioned before, I'd like to give a big thank you to our Masters in Global Supply Chain Management program who sponsored this event. And I know he's on the line now because I just made him co-host. Professor Tong is going to talk a little bit about the program and the structure. And then if there's any other remaining things, I guess we can address them, but I'm going to hand it over to Professor Tong. Go ahead.
Thank you, Steven. Hello, everybody. I'm Professor Tong. I'm the director of the graduate program in global supply chain. So it's wonderful to have the chance to hear the two experts, Brad and Scott, talking about especially the challenges to local supply chain. I'm very happy to hear Scott mentioned that he thinks the most important skill or the factor for a person to be a successful supply chain manager would be the drive. That's exactly what we have emphasized. The person not should just not have the drive to be a successful professional careerman, but also have the drive to be a better person. So that's throughout the program we emphasize to our students. And also, Scott mentioned the team player quality. All our students in this program, you're probably happy to know that are required to work in a group. And we, in the capstone course, the students from all different backgrounds need to work with each other and source the projects from local business. And so they can propose a solution to real business issues. So that's what we require students to do. And in our program, we have students from about a dozen different countries. And those students really learn from this process how to work effectively with each other. And I'm also happy to hear Brad mentioned that the most important factor Brad thinks, after going through our MBA program, is the willingness to change. I'm not sure if Brad taking our course is called Lead Organization Change. That's also in this program. So, and we also teach people, our students, the people skills, organizational behavior, and the negotiation. So those are definitely two very important components in our program. So I'm very happy that the program we are creating is really meeting the expectation of the industry experts. And as Steven mentioned, in this program, we teach the operations, global supply chain, Lean Six Sigma, and also the supply chain analysis. That's a major course taught by Steven. So, well, if any of you are interested to be a student to Steven, well, here is the chance. And lastly, we have the integration of the global skills as well as the data analytics skills together. So we all know that supply chain involves quite a few flows. The information flow is a very important one. So we integrate all the different databases skills for our students and encourage students to apply the analytics skills in not just the supply chain, but the global business. We teach courses in exporting, global sourcing, a bunch of different analytics courses. So some of you may know that our program is 12-month, 10-course program. So it's quite popular, even though we just launched it this year, we got quite, the application is actually past our expectations. So again, thank you very much, you guys. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me a message. Thank you, Steven. Thank you, Brad.
Of course.